I see my stepdad subtly waging war on my mother's memory within the house she shared with my father, threatening the last solid thing I have left of her. They say a house has a memory, that the walls soak up every laugh, every fight, every quiet moment, until the whole place breathes with a life of its own. If that's true, then my house remembers my mother. It remembers her planting the rose bushes by the front window, the ones that still bloom every June. It remembers the faint scratch she put on the hardwood floor in the hallway when she and my dad tried to move a bookshelf that was way too heavy for them. It remembers the sound of her voice, the smell of her cooking, the feeling of safety she created in every single room. This house was bought and paid for by my parents together more than 18 years ago. It was their foundation, the place they were going to build a life. After she was gone, it became my father's, and in a way it became mine. It is the one solid thing I have left of her. And for the last few years, it has been a place under siege. My name is Jordan Martinez. I was 17 at the time, and the person laying siege to my home was my stepdad, Joseph Alvarez. Joseph is 45. He's not a big man, not physically intimidating in the classic sense. He doesn't raise his voice or throw things. His brand of intimidation is quieter, more insidious. It's in the way he watches you when he thinks you're not looking. It's the way he'll stand in a doorway just silently observing, making the space feel small and crowded. He married my dad about 3 years after my mom passed. At first I tried. I really did. My dad was so broken, and Joseph seemed to put some of the pieces back together. He brought laughter back into the quiet rooms, and for that I was grateful. I wanted my dad to be happy, but gratitude has a shelf life, and it started to spoil the first time I saw Joseph looking at my mother's picture on the mantelpiece. It wasn't a look of respect for the woman who came before him. It was a look of annoyance, of resentment, like she was an obstacle, a ghost he was constantly trying to exorcise. He started small. He suggested we repaint the living room a soft yellow my mom had chosen to a cold, sterile gray. He talked about replacing the worn, comfortable armchair she used to love with something modern and leather. Each suggestion was a little spade, digging at the roots of our family, trying to unearth my mother's memory and toss it aside. My dad, bless his heart, is a good man, but he avoids conflict like the plague. He gently pushed back, saying things like, "Oh, Jordan's kind of attached to that chair," or "Your mom really loved that color." And Joseph would smile this tight, thin smile and say, of course, whatever you guys want." But the look in his eyes told a different story. It said, "This is temporary. One day, all of this will be mine to change." The problem for Joseph, the one he could never get around, was that none of it was his. Legally, emotionally, historically, he had no claim. He was a resident by marriage only. The deed to the house was in my father's name, and before that, in both my parents' names. Joseph contributed nothing to the mortgage, nothing to the history that soaked these walls. He was a guest with a key, and I think deep down he knew it. He knew that if anything happened to my dad, this house, this life he'd slotted himself into, would pass to me. I was the living, breathing embodiment of the past he couldn't erase and the future he couldn't control. I was a 17-year-old kid, and I was the biggest threat to his comfortable existence. This tension, this unspoken war over territory and memory, played out in the smallest details of our daily lives. It was a Cold War fought over thermostat settings and what we watched on TV, but its main battlefield day in and day out was the dinner table. Specifically, it was the dinner bowls. It sounds stupid, I know. How can a couple of bowls be a battlefield? But they were significant. They were part of a set my parents had received as a wedding gift. Over the years, most of the pieces had broken. A plate chipped here, a mug dropped there. All that was left was a serving platter and 2 identical ceramic dinner bowls. They were a deep blue with a slight, almost imperceptible swirl of a darker shade near the rim. They were heavy solid. We used them for everything: stew, pasta, big salads. Because there were only 2 of them, my dad and I were the ones who always used them. It was our little tradition, a silent nod to the original family unit. When Joseph moved in, he just used one of the plain white plates from the newer set. He never said anything about it, but I could feel him watching us. It was another thing that separated him, another reminder that he was an addition, not a part of the original foundation. About a year ago, my dad had to start traveling more for work. He'd be gone for a week or 2 at a time, leaving me and Joseph alone in the house. The atmosphere would change the second my dad's car pulled out of the driveway. The air would get thick, heavy. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was loaded with unspoken things. Joseph's passive aggressiveness would get a little less passive. He'd start making comments. "This place could really use an update," he'd say, running his hand over the kitchen counter my mom had picked out. "When I was your age, I was already working, not just living off my parents." He was constantly testing me, prodding, trying to get a reaction. I learned early on that the best defense was no defense. I just nod, give a non-committal, and go to my room. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a fight. My silence, my refusal to engage, seemed to make him even angrier. It was during these weeks alone that the ritual of the dinner bowls changed. Without my dad there, it was just me and Joseph. And every night he would serve dinner. And every night he would place one of the blue ceramic bowls in front of me and one in front of himself. He'd taken my dad's bowl. He was inserting himself into the tradition, trying to overwrite it. I hated it. I hated looking across the table and seeing him eating from that bowl, my father's bowl. It felt like a violation. But again, then I said nothing. What could I say? "Hey, you can't use that. It's my dad's bowl for our special tradition." I would have sounded like a child. So I just ate my dinner in silence, feeling the history of that simple object being rewritten right in front of me. The bowls were completely identical. There wasn't a scratch or a chip on either one of them that could tell them apart. You could put them side by side and you would have no idea which was which. It was a detail that seemed completely unimportant. Just a random fact about some old pottery. I had no idea that this simple, mundane fact, their perfect, indistinguishable sameness, was about to become the most important detail of my entire life. In the weeks leading up to that final awful night, Joseph had become different. The quiet resentment had started to curdle into something darker. The sideways glances were more frequent, and they held a new kind of intensity. He stopped making snide comments and instead just watched me with this cold, calculating look. It was the kind of look that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The kind of look that makes you double-check the lock on your bedroom door at night. I felt like a mouse being watched by a snake just waiting for the strike. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just a teenager who didn't like his stepdad. But a part of me, a primal, instinctual part, knew that something was wrong. The air in the house was charged electric with a coming storm. The quiet routines, the silent dinners, the identical blue bowls sitting on the counter waiting for our evening meal. It all felt like the set of a play right before the curtain rises on the final terrible act. And I was about to find out that my paranoia wasn't paranoia at all. It was a warning. That warning came on a Tuesday. My dad had been gone for 4 days on a trip to the West Coast, and the silence in the house had become a living thing. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence, a weight in the air that pressed down on you. Joseph and I had fallen into a pattern of avoidance that was almost an art form. We moved through the house like ghosts, occupying the same space at different times, leaving traces of our existence. A coffee mug in the sink, a book on the end table, but rarely crossing paths. The only time we were forced into the same room was for dinner, that silent, awful ritual at the dining room table. That evening, the air was thick and humid, the kind of late summer stillness where you can hear the buzz of a single fly from 2 rooms away. I was up in my room, supposedly doing homework, but really just staring at a blank page, the words blurring together. My mind was restless. The feeling of being watched, that constant low-grade hum of anxiety, had intensified since my dad left. I couldn't shake it. I decided to go downstairs to get a bottle of water from the fridge before Joseph started making dinner. I wanted to be in and out of the kitchen before he came in to minimize our interaction for the day. I took my shoes off at the top of the stairs, a habit from when I was a kid trying to sneak downstairs after bedtime. I moved quietly, my socked feet making no sound on the old hardwood floors. The hallway leading to the kitchen was dim, with only the fading daylight coming through the living room window. As I reached the doorway, I stopped. I could hear a faint noise from inside the kitchen, a soft, rhythmic sound. Asterisk, clink, clink, clink. It was the sound of a metal spoon stirring something in a ceramic bowl. I paused, pressing myself against the wall in the shadows of the hallway. My first thought was that he was just mixing a salad dressing or something. It was almost dinner time after all. The timestamp on my phone read 6:48 p.m., but something about the slowness of the sound, the deliberate, almost secretive way he was stirring, made me hesitate. It wasn't the hurried, noisy clatter of someone preparing a meal. It was careful. It was quiet. My heart started to beat a little faster. That feeling, the one I'd been calling paranoia, flared up like an alarm. I peered around the edge of the door frame, my head just barely poking out. The angle gave me a clear view of the kitchen island, and there was Joseph. His back was mostly to me. On the granite countertop in front of him sat the two blue ceramic bowls. Our bowls. My mom's bowls. They were sitting side by side just as they always were before dinner. He was leaning over one of them, the one on the left, which was always my spot at the table. His left hand was cupped around the side of the bowl, shielding it from view, while his right hand slowly stirred whatever was inside with a small teaspoon. But that wasn't what made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It was what was sitting on the counter next to the bowl. It was a small, dark amber glass bottle with a white screw-top lid. The kind of bottle you see in old pharmacies or for essential oils. There was no label on it. It was completely anonymous. As I watched frozen in the doorway, he finished stirring. He lifted the spoon, tapped it twice on the rim of the bowl, and then with a flick of his wrist, he licked the spoon clean and placed it silently in the sink. Then he picked up the little amber bottle, screwed the cap back on with a quiet twist, and slipped it into the pocket of his jeans. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. It was like watching a movie, something unreal that was happening to someone else. He's just adding a supplement, I thought. A vitamin powder. Something for my health. My brain was throwing out any plausible explanation it could find, trying desperately to build a wall against the horrifying truth that was crashing down on me. But I knew. I knew in my gut with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the tile floor beneath my feet, that what he had just done was not an act of care. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the counter. He looked at the two bowls. He ran his hand over his face, took a deep breath, and then he turned. He started walking towards the pantry at the far end of the kitchen, presumably to get the ingredients for whatever he was pretending to make for our dinner. He hadn't seen me. He had no idea I was there. The second he was out of my line of sight, I shrank back into the hallway, my back pressing hard against the cool plaster wall. I couldn't breathe. It felt like a vacuum had sucked all the air out of my lungs. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it from the next room. My thoughts were a chaotic storm of pure terror. He tried to poison me. He was trying to poison me. The man my father trusted, the man sleeping in my mother's bedroom, had just tried to end me. Every strange comment, every resentful look, every moment of tense silence from the past few years suddenly clicked into place. It wasn't just about him disliking me. It wasn't just about him wanting to be the man of the house. This house, my mom's house, he had no legal claim to it. It was my father's, and one day it would be mine. I was the obstacle. I was the living, breathing reminder that he was and always would be an outsider in this home. And he had just decided to remove the obstacle. A wave of nausea washed over me. I wanted to run. I wanted to sprint out the front door, down the street, and never look back. I wanted to call my dad, screaming and crying, and tell him what Joseph had done. I wanted to call the police. But what would I say? My stepdad put something from a weird bottle into my dinner bowl. He would deny it. He'd say it was a vitamin, just like my brain had tried to tell me. He'd say I was a dramatic teenager who hated him and was trying to cause trouble. The bottle was in his pocket. The substance, whatever it was already dissolved in the food. There was no proof. It would be my word against the word of a concerned 45-year-old man. And in that moment, I knew with chilling certainty that nobody would believe me until it was too late. I was trapped. He was going to call me for dinner in a few minutes. He was going to place that bowl in front of me, watch me with those cold, calculating eyes, and wait for me to eat it. He would watch me get sick. He would probably be the one to call the ambulance, to play the part of the distraught stepfather. He would be the hero. As the panic threatened to swallow me whole, something else rose up to meet it. It was a cold, sharp-edged anger, an anger born of pure survival instinct. How dare he do this in my mother's kitchen? In our home, the fear was still there, a frantic bird beating its wings inside my chest, but it was being pushed aside by this new icy resolve. I was not going to be a victim. I was not going to let him win. My eyes darted back towards the kitchen doorway. I could hear him rummaging around in the pantry. I had a few seconds, maybe a minute at most. My mind was racing, sifting through options, discarding them just as quickly. Running was a temporary solution. Calling for help was a gamble I couldn't afford to lose. I needed a different way out. I needed to be smarter than him. And then my gaze fell upon the two blue bowls still sitting side by side on the island. My bowl, the poisoned one on the left. His bowl, the clean one on the right. They were identical. There wasn't a scratch or a chip on either of them that could tell them apart. You could switch them and no one would ever know. It hit me like a physical blow. A plan so simple and so audacious bloomed in my mind in an instant. It was perfect. It was elegant. It used his own arrogance, his own meticulous planning against him. He was counting on me being the unsuspecting teenager. He was counting on the routine, on the familiarity of our silent dinners. He had prepared my bowl at my spot, knowing that I would sit down and eat without a second thought. He had created the perfect crime, and in doing so, he had handed me the perfect weapon. The sound from the pantry stopped. His footsteps started heading back toward the island. Time was up. I took one deep, silent breath, forcing the air into my screaming lungs. The terror was still there, but now it had a purpose. It was fuel. I pushed myself off the wall and slipped back up the stairs, my movements as silent as a shadow. He never knew I was there. I got to the top of the landing and quietly walked into my room, leaving the door open, just a crack. My heart was a war drum in the sudden quiet of the upstairs hall. I sat on the edge of my bed, my body trembling, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. The stage was set. The players were in position. He thought he had written the final act of this play, but he had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated me, and now I was going to rewrite the ending. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment. Wait for him to turn his back just for a second. That's all I would need. 1 second to walk over to that island and make a simple, tiny change. A change he would never, ever see coming. I could hear him call my name. "Jordan, dinner's ready." The voice was normal, casual, the same tone he'd used 1,000 times before. But tonight it sounded like a death sentence. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to stay put, to lock the door, to climb out the window. But I knew that would only delay the inevitable and make me look guilty of something. My only plan required me to walk down those stairs and play my part. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were filled with sand. I walked out of my room, pulling the door shut behind me, and started down the stairs. One step at a time. I focused on the sound of my own breathing, trying to keep it even. When I reached the bottom, I saw him. Joseph was standing by the fridge, his back to the island, pulling out a pitcher of iced tea. This was it. This was the moment. He hadn't poured the drinks yet. It was a window of maybe 5 seconds. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner trying to escape. Don't think, just move. My feet carried me into the kitchen, my path a straight line to the island. My hands, which had been trembling just moments before, were suddenly rock steady. With a fluid motion that felt both impossibly fast and agonizingly slow, I picked up the bowl on the left and the bowl on the right. I switched them. The ceramic made a soft, almost imperceptible whisper as it slid across the granite countertop. I didn't even look down. My eyes were locked on the back of his head, waiting for him to turn. But he didn't. He was still fumbling with the lid on the pitcher. I took my seat at the table, my back to the kitchen entrance, my hands in my lap. I had just served his last meal. He turned around, 2 glasses in his hand. "Here you go," he said, placing one in front of me and one at his spot. He walked back, picked up the 2 identical bowls, and set them down. He placed the poisoned one, the one he believed was mine, in front of me, and he placed my clean one in front of himself. He sat down, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. He thought he had me. He thought he was watching the final tragic moments of a 17-year-old boy he'd grown tired of. But he wasn't. He was looking at his own reflection. "Looks good," I said, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears. I picked up my fork. The food in my bowl, his intended meal, suddenly seemed like the most delicious thing I had ever seen. I took a bite, then another. I didn't look at him, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. The silence in the room was a physical weight. It was just the sound of 2 forks scraping against ceramic, his and mine. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him take his first bite, then a second. He was eating it. He was actually eating it. A part of my brain was screaming. It was a primal, terrified shriek that I had to actively suppress. "What have you done? This is real. This isn't a movie." But the other part of me, the cold, sharp-edged survivor, was calm. It reminded me that he had done this. He had bought the poison. He had shaken it into that bowl. He had made the choice. All I did was switch the name tags on the coffins he had built. We ate for a few minutes in that crushing silence. I finished about half of my food, pushing the rest around the bowl, making it look like I was done. I risked a glance up at him. He was eating normally, seemingly enjoying his meal. For a terrifying second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe it was just a vitamin. Maybe I was losing my mind, but then he cleared his throat. It was a small thing, but it was rough. He took a long drink of his iced tea. He cleared his throat again, harder this time. He looked at me and his eyes were confused. "Something's scratchy," he said, his voice a little hoarse. I just shrugged, my heart rate kicking up a notch. "Maybe it's allergies." He shook his head and then he coughed. A real deep cough that racked his 45-year-old frame. He put his fork down. He pressed a hand to his chest, his brow furrowed in a mixture of pain and bewilderment. He knew. In that instant, I saw the flicker of realization in his eyes. He looked down at his bowl, then across the table at mine. He looked at me, and the cold, calculating mask was gone. In its place was pure, unadulterated panic. He had made a mistake. A fatal, irreversible mistake. "What did you do?" He rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I just stared back at him, my expression blank. I didn't have to say a word. He knew. He pushed his chair back from the table, a clumsy scraping sound against the tile floor. He tried to stand, but his legs seemed to buckle. He grabbed the edge of the table for support, his knuckles white. His breathing was becoming ragged, shallow. He was sweating beads of it, forming on his forehead. You switched them," he choked out, his eyes wide with a terror I had only seen in movies. I stood up slowly, my own chair making no sound. I picked up my plate and my glass and walked them to the sink. My movements were deliberate, calm. I could hear him gasping for air behind me. I rinsed my plate, placed it in the dishwasher, and then I turned to face him. He was leaning heavily on the table, his face pale and clammy. "I think you need a doctor, Joseph," I said, and my voice was steady. It was the voice of a concerned stepson. He tried to say something, to curse at me, to threaten me, but all that came out was a strangled gurgle. He collapsed back into his chair, his body slumping. It was happening faster than I could have imagined. I walked over to the kitchen drawer, the one where we keep the odds and ends, and I pulled out my phone. I unlocked it and dialed 3 numbers, 911. The operator's voice was calm and professional on the other end, and my voice when I answered her was just as calm. "Yes, I need an ambulance. My stepdad, he's 45. I think he's having a heart attack or he's been poisoned. I don't know. We were just eating dinner and he collapsed. Please hurry." I gave them our address. The address of the house my mother and father had bought together over 18 years ago. My home. While I was on the phone, I watched Joseph slide from the chair onto the floor. His eyes were still open, staring at me with a look of pure hatred and disbelief. He had been so sure of his plan, so arrogant. He never once considered that the 17-year-old kid he saw as an obstacle could ever outsmart him. The paramedics arrived in minutes, a whirlwind of calm professional chaos. They swarmed into the kitchen asking me questions I answered with perfect rehearsed sincerity. I didn't know what happened. We were just eating. He just started coughing. They loaded him onto a stretcher, and as they wheeled him out the front door, a police officer gently guided me aside. He told me I'd need to come to the hospital to give a statement. I just nodded, playing the part of the shocked, traumatized kid. At the hospital, they put me in a small, quiet room. It smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the adrenaline slowly draining out of me, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Finally, a detective came in. She was older with kind eyes but a no-nonsense expression. She introduced herself and asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. And so I did. I told her about the tension in the house. I told her about seeing Joseph from the stairs standing over my bowl. I told her about the little bottle he'd put back in his pocket. I told her about the 2 identical ceramic bowls. I told her I was scared that I knew no one would believe me. And then I told her exactly what I did. I told her I switched them. I watched her face as I spoke, expecting to see disbelief, suspicion, maybe even accusation. But I saw none of that. She just listened, her pen scratching across her notepad, documenting every single word. When I finished, the clock on the wall read 9 p.m. The room was silent. "You understand the gravity of what you're telling me," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, my voice clear. He tried to end me. I was defending myself. She nodded slowly. We recovered the bowl he was eating from. It's being sent to the lab for testing. We'll also be getting a warrant for your house and for Joseph Alvarez's personal effects. If there's a bottle like the one you described, we'll find it. She paused, looking at me intently. You were very brave and very smart. You did the right thing. Relief washed over me so powerfully it almost brought me to my knees. It was over. The truth was out. I wasn't the villain. I was the survivor. They confirmed it later. The substance was a common, commercially available poison. They found the bottle in the pocket of the jacket Joseph had been wearing. His credit card records showed he'd purchased it 2 weeks ago. The case against him was open and shut. He survived, but his life as he knew it was over. He would recover in a hospital bed only to be transferred to a jail cell. He would never set foot in my home again. When I finally got back to the house late that night, it was quiet. The kitchen had been cleaned. The 2 bowls were gone, taken as evidence. It was just my house. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe inside its walls. I walked through the silent rooms, my hand trailing along the familiar furniture. This was my mother's home, my father's home, my home, and I had protected it. I had protected myself. I was only 17, but in the span of a single evening, I felt like I had aged a decade. The fear and the anger had receded, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty. He had tried to write me out of my own story, but he failed. I was still here, and I was safe. I had taken his perfect crime and I had turned it into his perfect punishment, and I would not feel a single moment of guilt for the rest of my life.